All right, next in Athlon, you got Auburn Tigers. Man,
Anything been going on this offseason?
I mean everything is going on at Auburn, but they still got a lot of talent to work with. It's not like this is a cupboard that's completely bare. They and I like to joke, of course. If you think Auburn, you expect nothing from them, they'll stun you. You put them high in the standings, they'll be a complete disaster. So this could be a breakout team in the SEC. I know a lot of staff turnover, but what's your thoughts? I mean, there's so many questions with Auburn, but where would you go with the quarterbacks? Because we've seen high and lows from Calzada and Finley, and then Robbie Ashford. Where would you go with that thing?
Yeah, man, that's a great question because I think we've seen that these. I mean, Ashford had a great spring game. We
Mm-hmm.
don't. I think we know probably the least about him from
Right.
based upon game action in the regular season. Calzada had the great win against Texas A&M, against Alabama at Texas A&M. He was also beat up too last year, so and he's still
Right.
kind of dealing with that through the spring. Finley was also beat up. It feels like Finley and Calzada have something to work with. The question is, what kind of level can you get that to? I would probably start Calzada if I was calling the shots at Auburn. I think in general, I think maybe it is a good thing that they are a little bit under the radar. I mean, after everything that's gone on, last end of last season, the
Mm-hmm.
5 game losing streak, the chaos with Harsin status in January and February. So, I mean, it's not there is still plenty of talent here. There's just a lot of questions, and also I think you get into that scenario where if they're sitting there later in the season and the win total's not there, you get those question marks about the coaching staff again.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the coaching staff, I had a Auburn beat writer on a couple of months ago. He said that Derek Mason just hated Harsin and hated working for him after being together. So, I mean, you look at it on paper and you say, well, this is a downgrade at defensive coordinator to Jeff Schmedding, which it may not be because I don't know much about Jeff Schmedding.
He was
But,
good at Boise State, and he having that familiarity with Harsin.
well, that's the thing.
Yeah,
I mean, many people may perceive that because I think Derek Mason will do great at Oklahoma State with what he's got to work with. But could it possibly be an upgrade with just, familiarity and not having that angst or whatever you want to call it in that locker room?
yeah. I think to go back to Arkansas, that staff that staff togetherness, that camaraderie that you have, like maybe they're a little bit more cohesive this year,
Mm-hmm.
and just I mean I think Harsin needs some guys who know the SEC and understand it to be able to recruit and be able to just understand the league. It's what Brian Kelly had to do this year at LSU.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I think there is something to be said about trusting, guys you've worked with, hiring them and trusting them to do the job. And he clearly either didn't trust his staff last year, or maybe it was a combination of a lot of factors there. So there's something to be said about familiarity, but I also think that if I was hiring coordinators, Derek Mason would be the guy that I would hire
Right.
over Schmedding.
And I think back to that Auburn, South Carolina game where I believe it was like 4th and 1, 4th and 2. You got Tank Bigsby, and what do they draw up? They draw up like a play action deep shot to a tight end who was triple covered, and it's like I don't know who called that, Harson or Bobo, one of them, but let's hope for Auburn's sake that was Bobo that called that because maybe we'll get more on the same page. But it just seemed like nothing was on the same page late last season, did it?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think Harson is likely going to call the plays this year, it seems like, for Auburn. So I think that is a positive. I think for all that's gone on, I still think Harson's a pretty good X's and O's coach. And I think we saw this last year, starting 6-2. I think we saw some improvement out of Bo Nix. I don't want to be part of the Bo Nix meme or anything like that. He's gonna. But I do think I trust Harson to figure some things out. I think the problem with Auburn, though, is you can go up and down their positions and see, do they have some guys at receiver that can stretch the field? Offensive line, they've got a lot of guys back. They've been pretty inconsistent at that group. The strength of that team is the running backs
Yeah.
with Bigsby and Hunter. But also, I think it gets at the problem, which is there's just not a lot of margin for error. And so
Mm-hmm.
they really need one of those quarterbacks to step up and improve the passing game because we've talked about Arkansas and we'll talk about others. There's really not much of a difference between 3 and 6 in the West. If Auburn can get better quarterback play, they've got a good defense, they've got good running backs, but that margin for error is just so small that it feels like this is a team that's going to have to win a lot of 24-20 type games in order to get to that next year.
And speaking to not having much margin for error, I'm curious to know where you lay on this because it's a lot of people have Auburn as literally the toughest job in the country because of course you're in the same state as Nick Saban and that juggernaut. You got on the East, you got to play that juggernaut. So as the SEC is currently constructed, I mean, not only do you got to go through the rugged West, but you literally have the toughest path with your two annual opponents. Where would you be at with Auburn? Do you think it is the toughest job in the country?
I guess it's kind of tough to say toughest because I often think like if you're talking Power Five
Maybe
jobs,
Vanderbilt.
it's like Vanderbilt, Kansas, Duke, Wake
Right.
Forest, the smaller schools with the academic challenges. So I think it's one of the more unique jobs in college football because of we've seen. I mean, just Auburn being Auburn, some of these
Right.
things that have happened. But it also is a job that you've seen. You can win the national title here. You can potentially push for a playoff spot. So I think it maybe had the widest variance of
Yeah.
we've talked about it in previous years of just being a wild card team. Like it just seems like a wild card program. Like one year you could be 11-1, it'd be after being picked seventh in the West, it'd be 6-6 after being projected to finish in the top 10. So it is a fascinating place, and it's only going to get even more intriguing if this is a team that is 6-6 at the end of the year or worse, depending
Right.
on what happens.
But one thing we haven't hit on with the Auburn, Stephen, is the schedule. I mean, right out the gate, you got a ton of home games. Mercer, San Jose State, Penn State, Missouri, LSU. I mean, if things break right, you could be 5-0. But that the key to that all that is going to be Penn State. So I was going to ask you. I know on your YouTube channel you just previewed Penn State. So what can you tell Auburn fans about the challenge of Penn State coming in?
Yeah, shameless plug. There is a preview of Penn State up on my YouTube channel, and I think this is a team that is 11-11 over the last 2 years, and they've sort of underachieved. And I think it's kind of a critical year to see if James Franklin has this program going in the right direction. Of course, Auburn lost in Happy Valley last year. A team that's got question marks at line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball, and a little bit of uncertainty at quarterback. Sean Clifford's a veteran, but I think it was a question of what's the ceiling there? Can he take it to another level? So I think if you're Auburn, getting Penn State early in the season at home after losing close last year, and I think you could argue maybe this Penn State team is not as good as last year, that this should be a winnable game for Auburn. And I think it's one they probably have to have considering the second half of that schedule, still playing A&M and Alabama. So with 8 home games and Penn State coming in, I think that's the path to me for Auburn to get to 6-7 wins is beating Penn State and holding serve at home in some of those games.
Mm. All right, next.